collaborators in feminist theologies. Third Horizons conversation. You're all very welcome. Today we have the honour of the Reverend Dr. Jo Inkpin. So in a moment I'm going to pass over to her. But just a little bit of housekeeping and then some acknowledgements. No, we'll do acknowledgements first and then housekeeping. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the land from which we are all Zooming. And I'm certain it's not the same land. So rather than name them all, as I acknowledge that I come from the land of the Jajawarong people, and I pay respect to the elders past, present and future, and bow my head in shame that this land was never ceded, I'd like us just to hold a few moments where we consider in thankfulness the land from which we all come. And now in turn, we acknowledge the LGBTIQ+ leaders, past, present and future. We are so grateful for the work that has been done, mindful of the cost and the lives that have suffered. And we bow our heads in shame when we consider all that has been done wrongly and badly, ungraciously. And we are so thankful that we can be here today and engage freely and enthusiastically together. And so once again, we'll just take a few moments to consider those leaders who we know and be thankful for the work that they have done and that they continue to do. Now it gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce the Reverend Dr. Jo Inkpin. And the way this next hour and a half is going to work, hopefully, is Jo is going to be talking, and there's going to be questions and interaction between myself and some other people. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, if you'd like to just raise your hand, Zoom etiquette, that's not permission, that's an indicator. I would like to speak, and then I'll invite you in. Or you can put a question on the chat line, and Talitha and Rebecca will be managing those questions. Just a word of recognition that any words or questions that we deem to be inappropriate, disrespectful, anything other than celebratory and honouring of this dialogue will be acknowledged and then ignored. So that's the way we're going to deal with all these Horizons conversations. So please feel free to join in. Jo has a lot to say, and it may be a little bit rude because every now and again I'm going to butt in and say, hey Jo, I've got a question. So I apologise in advance for what might appear to be a little bit bombastic, but you know, Zoom every now and again we've got to. So if everyone's happy to work that way, are there any questions before I pass over to Jo?
Yes, quick question.
Yes.
John Dewitt of Faithfully Yours Australia.
Yes.
I will be on the phone, so I won't be able to put my hand up or ask questions. I might be able to. Is there another way that I can email in? No,
John, please feel free to say question. Speak it out loud. And we apologise in advance if we talk over one another, but I think I can say that we recognise that our intention is to engage in a dialogue. So okay, John,
very good.
Please say question, and if Jo doesn't hear you, I will, and I will make space for your question to be asked. Are we all happy about that? Great. So Jo, would you like to introduce yourself and then off we go?
Yes, thank you. I'm here on the land of the Jajawarong people, and I honour their elders and the people of this land have cared for it for so long. It's a great joy to be part of this. I think the first thing I want to say is a big thank you to Kath, and I'm going to say this now, I think, because it's important to what I'm talking about, which is about intersectionality. And I want to say, I hear this word a lot, but I want to know what it is, and I want to know how it's done, because I hear lots about intersectionality, but it doesn't always work very well. And I rang up Kath, I remember last year, and said about the conference that was held in Melbourne, I said, are trans people really welcome? Because often in gatherings, we often are sort of said to be, but then you find, well, yeah, you're welcome to be there, as it were, but not actually to be heard. And obviously, the fact I'm speaking is a sign that this group isn't like that. And so I'm delighted that we have a space here that enables us properly to engage and to be a model of intersectionality, I suppose, and our voice to be heard. So I do rattle on a lot, but I think I hope what I've got to say might, provoke some thoughts. In thinking how I was going to describe myself, I think what I want to talk about is, and I invite you to think about, is intersectionality as what I would call a transing process, not, as it were, just a coalition of different types of people who intersect and all the rest of it and in our own lives, but that's actually a dynamic process. And that's one of the gifts, I think, that a reflection on it from a gender diverse person that transgender people bring. So I am a trans person, but I'm also a transing person, and that's a much bigger thing. Because when I think back through my life, I've done a lot of transing, and that's partly in terms of gender, but it's also in other things, in terms of working ecumenically, doing a lot of work on interfaith work, also working on the boundaries between First Nations people and white people, and a number of other and intersections between, for instance, when I was in England as a rural environment officer, between farming communities and environmentalists. So all of that is, and I think that's part of the gift actually that transgender people can have, because we spend our time having to translate, if we're born into or assigned a particular gender, and then we have to sort of translate our way through. So that's part of what I want, I think, to encourage you to sort of think of theology as a transing process. Does that make sense? So I'm obviously English, you can probably tell from my accent. And I've been in Australia since 2001, and I worked, I'm married to another woman, so we're the first couple who's in the Anglican directory as a married couple, I believe. And she was one of the first female priests in England. So we were part of the movement for the ordination of women's struggle. And my PhD was on first wave Christian feminism, on the struggle for the vote and the religious aspects of that. So that's part of my journey. And since I've been in Australia, I worked for the National Council of Churches, New South Wales Ecumenical Council, and then I've been a priest in Brisbane, up in Toowoomba, and then now teach as a theology lecturer here in Brisbane. So that's a little bit about me. We can come back to some of those things if it's helpful. No doubt we can develop those. But what I wanted to offer, and some of you will possibly, I don't know how many of you will have read the little piece that I wrote to stimulate thought, really. And it was, I ended up with a passage from Mary Oliver's poem, Breakage. And what I thought would be, and the reason that I did that is because it spoke to me beautifully, but also because what I think it points to me, I also wanted to say about transing is that for me, theology it's more like poetry than it is, an exercise of law of, chopping and changing and creating a constitution, which I think it is for a lot of people, what's in and what's out and stuff. It requires, as Mary Oliver's poetry does, tremendous attention actually, and contemplative skill, and attention to words. And there's a lot in this poem we could tease out from that. So it has rhythms and what's name, and it's not mere, not anything goes, but it's actually, and it invites participation actually. It's not like prose, which is sort of trying for it is saying something, but it's one that hopefully is invitation. At least it is with Mary Oliver.
Joe, can I just briefly say that after you have read this poem, I'm going to suggest that we sit in silence for 2 minutes. And the invitation is to participate and then engage with Joe. So I know silence might not be usual in a Zoom context for some people, but the mystery and the magic is still there when we gather. Thank you, Joe. Okay.
Breakage. It's called Breakage, and that's related obviously to the themes, eggshells, landmines, and faultlines that can cause, that actually trans people have to negotiate. But we're looking at something more beautiful. Breakage by Mary Oliver. I go down to the edge of the sea. How everything shines in the morning light, the cusp of the whelk, the broken cupboard of the clam, the opened blue mussels, moon snails, pale pink, and barnacles scarred, and nothing at all whole or shut, but tattered, split, dropped by the gulls onto the grey rocks, and all the moisture gone. It's like a schoolhouse of little words, thousands of words. First you figure out what each one means by itself. The jingle, the periwinkle, the scallop, full of moonlight. Then you begin slowly to read the whole story.
And Joe, as we read this poem and listening to you read it in the context of your comments about intersectionality, and I'm reading the last phrase here, then you begin, I want to parenthesize, hopefully, to read the whole story. Can I ask you, what does intersectionality, what does this demand of us?
Well, I think that's what I'm particularly feeling for, because I'm speaking at the moment from, and the other day there was a little announcement about the latest book that J.K. Rowling's releasing, and there's been a lot of aggravation that transgender people, especially transgender women, although some men actually, those who give birth to children are also getting, which is interesting, isn't it? But we come under the hammer from a small number of people who associate themselves with feminism often, and seem to be part of an old school. So to me, I talked in the little thing I wrote about a grammar of assent, how that's intersectionality requires, it's not just content, but it's also process of how we go about it and how we actually enable people's voices and presences and bodies to be actually properly, fully recognized. So what I was suggesting, as I say earlier, is that to look at it, how can we look at it in a dynamic? What does it require of us? I think it requires of us that we are ourselves transing, so we're not fixed. So that's why I talked about shells a bit, because I think shells protect, a bit like borders today, you know, that they can protect us for a while, but they're actually quite inhibiting as well. So how do we find ways to cherish, to make sure that we protect our, from getting deeply hurt, but we don't use our shells and our borders as ways of violating or creating violence for other people? So
that's really interesting, because as you're talking, shells can be used as weapons. They
yes.
can be used as borders. They can be used as decorations.
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether you can make a link between your metaphor of shells and this idea of a grammar of assent.
Yes, well, I think one of the things I drew up from Mary Oliver's from the poem, she's talking there about, and I think she's been quite careful there to talk about breakage rather than brokenness, which is a very popular concept in parts of the Christian church, which is used to apply generally, you know, sin, fallenness and brokenness, but it's usually applied to certain types of people and holds up a sort of idea of imperfection. So what I think she's saying is not saying that, is that there might be breakages in our life, and people have traced the fact, you know, that Mary herself suffered some forms of sexual abuse when she was young. So she's talking about this thing about there's healing in this, and so shells are important to give us, I think, space sometimes, or to make sure we're not overwhelmed, as a friend of mine was recently, you know, sadly committed suicide because life just got too much for her, and there's some protection needed. But we also we can, yes, turn it around to other people. And I think what my sense is that we're happy to have shells for us. Some people are happy to have shells for themselves, but when they get to a certain point, they start to use that shell, yes, as a device to protect themselves from other truths. You know, someone like Germaine Greer, you know, did a fantastic job in her own era back when, and she still was, but then use the tools that she used to, you know, to prise open, to break open new life and emerge from her own negative shells to sort of attack others. Yes, does that answer your question a bit?
Oh, it just makes me want to ask so many more questions, but I am mindful that when we talked about where we might go today, I did ask if you would assume that not everyone in the room, so to speak, is really clear on the difference between and the relatedness of gender and sexuality. And from your transing viewpoint, could you maybe talk to that? Assume that no one knows anything, and then I think there will be some, or that no one knows everything. And let's assume that there'll be some questions that bubble up here as we continue to explore with you along the beach line as we're combing.
Yes. Well, one of the things, I think this is part of what I think is that I think we're actually, I mean, it's an exciting time, but it's a scary time. And this is why, you know, there's people in different quarters, J.K. Rowling, sadly, Germaine Greer and people like that, as well as the people way to the right, like Mark Latham, who are resistant to new ways of conceiving things. So I'm not sure I could I'm not an expert on, you know, a simple definition of sexuality and gender, but as I understand it, and historically, that things have changed, as that our conceptions of gender and sexuality are going through quite a big change, and that's good actually, because it means that lots of gender diverse people particularly, but also women and some men can then be heard in ways they haven't before. And what's happened is that sexuality and gender are often conflated, and they're not the same, but there is an interaction. So that's why we have LGBTIQA, etc. in the alphabet soup of sexually and gender diverse people, because our struggles are similar, because there's lots of, and sometimes they overlap, they intersect, because, you know, I mean, I'm married to a woman, and so now I'm prone to people attacking me for being, you know, in the same gender, same sex relationship, all that sort of thing. But for me, the word sex does have a biological component to it, but I think our sexuality and our gender are more to do with our orientation, our identity, and they're more a soul thing actually, particularly when it comes to gender. And gender is essentially a social construct. It is affected, and a friend of mine says, another trans priest says, we do sometimes want to have it both ways, in the sense that it's not just an idea we've got in our heads that we're female or whatever. It does relate to our bodies, our body experience. And so, and scientists are still tracking down things, you know, it's probably something to do with hormones released in the womb and various other things. And our brain, it seems, some of the research, more needs doing, but our research, trans women's brains are similar to cisgender women's brains. And so there may be a biological component, but ultimately I think gender is something that we feel. I think it's a soul thing. And there's a difference too between gender expression and gender identity. So a drag queen, for example, isn't female, I don't think, even though they may express, you know, they might dress up, and some of them might be quite convincing or something, but it's a little bit of a fluid thing, because they also belong to in some ways they belong to the transgender community. So that's why that's where we get into those fault lines, and why it becomes quite problematic. But sexuality is, I mean, I have sexuality, but also have gender. So my sexuality, I am female, and I'm drawn towards women, but it's not because I'm a transgender person that I'm drawn towards women. I could be drawn to, I mean, I'm not drawn to men or whatever, or others, you know, so that's why we now talk about pansexuality, don't we, as a way. And that's another example of the way in which we're actually trying to move beyond these, what have been quite confining terms. So sexuality is, you know, what it is about, you know, what you're drawn to. For me, gender is to do, I mean, somebody asked me this the other day, and I think it is to do with your orientation thing, but it's not to do with, you know, what you happen to have inside yourself or between your legs or anything else, although that might shape you quite a lot, and it does, obviously, because our society says that certain people have got certain biological frameworks are of more value than others, I think. So, and how you appear, and if you dress in a particular way, you're likely to, your gender expression is likely to incur reward or otherwise. Does that make some sense too?
I've got a question to add on to that, and then I'm really hoping that we can hear some other questions. You spoke about people who hold a very public resistance. You mentioned Mark Latham.
Yes.
And I've always been interested in the concept of resistance, because it seems to me that our capacity for transformation is far greater and far more terrifying than any limitations we may experience. So I wonder, resistance to what? And linking you back to this idea of transing, transformation. I mean, this lovely notion that you have of the transing, the process of engaging in the business of being a person, and this idea of theology being a transing process that you just dropped in there as if it was a perfectly normal concept. And I can imagine we all know people that very thought would explode within them as being an impossible idea. So that I've just put a few more of your words back towards you. You could maybe, you know, think about resistance to what? The transformation.
Well, I think it's resistance to, I mean, you know, working ecumenical, I mean, I was blessed. I've got still got a couple of lovely Orthodox priests, friends, by the importance that the Orthodox tradition, particularly Christianity, puts on transfiguration. And that's about recognizing that we're on a journey. And I think that's the trans words. You see, if we use more trans words, we'd be getting a lot further. Transformation, for example, that for me is the heart of healthy religion. And that all of us, and as a society together, and as a planet, we're called to transformation. That's what, there isn't a fixed creation, I suppose. That's the starting point, obviously. And that it's constantly changing, and we're called into being. So we're not, in that sense, you know, to use, you know, old feminist sort of language, Simone de Beauvoir once said, you know, a woman is not born but made. You know, it's part of a process that we do, and we're called into being what we are. So for me, that we're all, that's why I'm talking about transing, because you might be transgender, that's a particular type of person, but all of us are called to be transfigured, and all of us are called to be part of the transformation of everything. And if we started to look at read the Bible that way, and started to do our theology that way, as tools, as it were, of transformation, and witnesses to transformation. I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, that poor old man Moses was stuck, really, and, you know, was quite afraid and everything else. And then he had that experience, so he told the Bible, of the burning bush, and it was a transformative experience. And although he then struggled to, you know, to become what he was called to be, he did eventually find some courage to lead his people into liberation and find his own liberation. And I think that's the thing. And I suspect, I mean, one of the things I think is why trans people are sort of quite scary to people, for some people, is one, they don't know who we are and never met a lot of us, or they think they haven't. Actually, they've probably been sitting next to them in pews and everything else for years in churches. But is that we call people into change, and people don't like that there's more to life. And so I think there's a lot of quite frightened people, aren't there? I mean, poets have spoken, T.S. Eliot and people have spoken about that in the past, you know, how, you know, there's a lot of frozen, frightened people. And so you defend your shells in which you've got life. And if I've got anything from a transgender point of view, is that, you know, I tried to live in the shell because it was safer in a way to live in the male world. But I mean, eventually you shrivel up and die, or you become more and more angry. And I think, you know, I mean, I'm not saying Mark Latham is a woman or anything, or he's called into being that, but I think Mark has lost his way somewhere, that he hasn't come to terms with parts of himself. And some people want, you know, their call to transing is to change from being a banker to a poet or something, or from something else to a banker or something, you know, that. So I think it's that human experience. That for me is the religious quest for authenticity and expression. And I think transgender people, that's what we ultimately are trying to do. So I think it's, in a way, the transgender vocation, as it were, is, yeah, it's a spiritual one, even if you don't put a capital S with it. There's a lot there, isn't there? So.
So I wonder how this transing process of being and of thinking theologically and being religiously, how it relates to the idea you mentioned before of a grammar of assent. And I imagine you mean A-S-S-E-N-T.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So
yes.
a grammar of agreement.
Yes.
What could we possibly agree on, given the variety and the flux of this transing process that we all are gathered together in? What is the grammar of assent for us in that?
Well, I think it's about, I mean, it's partly what the poet's speaking about there for me anyway. It's part of that contemplative thing of, part of it is, like she talks at the end of that poem, Prince, of the different shells, and that until we've attended to each of the shells, so that until people's voices have been heard. I mean, years ago, Pope John Paul II had words put into his mouth, I think, when he spoke to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people when he visited in Alice Springs. And it's a quote I've always remembered. And he said that until your gifts have been fully offered and joyfully received, he said, the church in Australia will not be the church that Jesus Christ wants it to be. And it's the same with, it's not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, probably most profoundly of all we need to listen to, because they're the periwinkles or whatever, the jingles, whatever. But there are these other shells that we haven't really, who haven't been offered because they've been buried or they've had to hide, or whatever, and they need now to be treated seriously with respect. So the first thing is about respect, listening to those voices that we agree that we, if you like, I don't know, and to develop that sort of a grammar of assent sort of language, you know, J.H. Newman talked about. I mean, he was also into a reserve in communicating knowledge. Religious knowledge, because they were aware, he and the Tractarians at that time were aware of the mystery of God that had been sort of lost by the low church sort of thinking thing and evangelicalism. So that we leave space for the mystery to break through. And that's part of the job, I think, of what queer theologians are doing. And they're trying to break it with, the fault lines are good to have, to break it open. But in doing so, people can feel as if there's an earthquake and we're falling to bits. So it's recognition and a willingness to work on a new story, because that's what the poet is also saying at the end of it, is we won't get the whole story until all of these things have been, these voices have been heard and are able to be expressed. And some of them don't even know what they want to say yet. I mean, like me, you know, we're working out as we go, so we're making sense of these things.
No, I've got this really strong image in my head as you're talking in response to Rebecca's question and the poem that's lovely in front of us, that there's something about a language of assent and the sort of the theological link that you're making in relation to beach combing. So when I walk along the beach combing, I expect to find something. I comb because there's treasures there to be discovered.
Yes.
So there's something there about an expectation that there is another voice, another thought, another opinion.
Yes.
And we wait, or we seek it out, or we discover
Yes.
Does that make sense to you? That it's a strong image as you're talking about
Yes,
having.
but that's very much Mary. That's what I see with Mary Oliver. I mean, that was a big thing for her. You know, if you said what her spiritual practice was, I think she said that it was going walking, and actually, that's something I identify with a particular spirit of openness to things. And I was struck by Sheldon. This is one of the things that came to mind for me because I was away for a few days recently down at Burley Heads, and it's part of the Gold Coast, one of the few parts of the Gold Coast that has still got some of its Aboriginal heritage. At the bottom end of things, Jelligal, I think, the headlands there. And if you walk round there, it's a magnificent spot. You get into Tallybudgera Creek, and that in itself is beautiful. And in that space, you're receiving and connecting. So that's part of the intersection. You're connecting more deeply with the spirit of the place, the spirit of the land as well. But they also there's a midden there, and they had to put signs up telling people not to take away the bits of the shells, because the shells themselves are they're part of the life of that place and of the community and of the people who've been there. And some of those bits, that, you know, lots of them are quite things that they're part of the breakage that Mary's talking about. But if we were to treasure properly the breakages, as it were, the middens and all the other sites, the sacred sites of our land, then we would, and attend to them properly, we would receive, and we'd get, because that's part of the gift, the Aboriginal gift, isn't it, to us? So, and the land itself speaks, but it's the same with other people. Everyone who comes into our life, you know, I mean, I've got a wonderful electrologist who's, she had to flee Iran because she was a Baha'i, and at the time of the revolution, and but she enriches my life tremendously. And indeed, we've shared some, understand our Persian poetry, absolutely amazing stuff, you know. So though that's what starts to connect us on a deep level. Because what I think, what worries me a little bit about sometimes about progressive movements, as it were, is that we talk about allies and alliances, but alliances are very fragile. And as Aboriginal people have said and others, that's actually what we want is accomplices. Because if you're an accomplice, you're committed, you do things with people, and you yourself can get arrested, put on the blacklist. And you yourself are taking risks. A lot of allies, you can always step back, you know, from the situation. Whereas those who are in the middle of the struggle, we cannot, we live it every day. We can't decide whether or not we're going to, you know, worry about Mark Latham or J.K. Rowling or something as a trans person, because we can't, because it immediately impacts on us, whereas allies can step back. And to build...
Can I interrupt you there just for 1 minute, because would love to talk about the accomplishment, but just to go back in relation to the language of assent. You mentioned you're a Persian friend and sharing different languages. Can you speak about what it means to hear something that you can't understand? So when we're talking about language engagement.
Yes. Well, I think that's the challenge of non-violence. You see, I mean, we had, I was involved with for the National Campus on the Decades to Overcome Violence. It was about creating a culture of peace and reconciliation. Unfortunately, during that time, we went and invaded Iraq and everything else, which didn't really help, and shut the borders to refugees and all that. But it's about, that's on the macro level, but it is about that culture. And a lot of people have done a lot of work on that we need continually to treasure. So I would put that at the groundings of that. You know, groups like the Franciscans, Pache Benny and others, and Quakers have done some wonderful works in prisons as well, and others in terms of trying to find ways. And that is about, back to the gender and violence thing, this is not, and I don't know, my gorgeous friend next door might want to come in on this, but Janice McRandall, is that about empathy? Because you hear a lot about empathy, and you're supposed to, you know, and empathy is a good thing, but I think it's what nonviolence says is that it talks about two hands of nonviolence. The first is to say no, stop, before you do so there's two hands. You need another hand that actually reaches out, and that's quite vulnerable because you might get hurt with it. But unless you've got the two hands together, empathy becomes ultimately collusion, complicity with oppression. So if a church, for example, wants to help LGBT people, it doesn't set up meetings where it brings in the most reactionary people to discuss with LGBTI people where you go, because in doing so, you're colluding. You're not doing the stop. It's afterwards that you might deal with the problems that these people have got with people. But the right of people to exist does not need to be debated. So there are some. So the ground of set is not for me is not just. It's not just a nicey. Let's all develop emotional intelligence and empathy. You might need to do that. It also requires a standpoint. I think you have to decide: are you going to stand with where oppression is clearly? You've got to listen to where oppression is named, and you need to stand with those people and take the risk of being stoned with them, basically.
Okay, so I'm going to invite Janice and then Michelle, and I just want to make a little observation that when I asked about what it meant to engage without understanding, you brought violence in. So somehow a lack of understanding is correlated here to violence, which I think is really important, which then leads us to empathy. So Janice and then Michelle.
I'm choking on a lozenge, sorry. Some Freudian slip there. I just wanted this idea of accomplices and not allies. And I wonder if it's just a question for you, Joe, because I'm sure you could speak to this around, it makes me think of, the text by Sarah Ahmed, Living a Feminist Life. Like feminism isn't a method for academic work. It's a call to a particular kind of lifestyle. The same with intersectionality. It's what does it mean to live a life committed to the kind of rubrics we mean by when we say intersectionality. So my question, wondering if you could speak to around that, what does an intersectional stance or an accomplice's stance, what is required of us? Because I'm sure you could speak to the many people in your life that might be allies, but when the crunch time came, were silent. I wonder what you'd have to say about that.
Well, I think for me, it depends where you start from your theology. See, I think for me, the basis of like a biblical theology, whatever, will be about shalom. And that's what to see Jesus seeking, proclaiming, witnessing, and everything else. But with it comes, and Jesus was quite explicit about that. I know it's been distorted a bit, but that it comes with risk and suffering, and that is bound up into it. And that if you're going to do that, it's going to hurt, and it's going to hurt internally. So for a trans person, and for a lot of us, isn't it? I mean, in our own journeys, we're going to have to face our own demons as well. And sometimes they can be the worst ones, as well as the things that are outside us. So it does require considerable courage. And that's why I think, it's become institutionalized, hasn't it? But I mean, the community of people seeking shalom, which is what the church should be, is there to enable us to have the courage, in a way, to be a bit of a shell, a bit of a protection, but not to make itself pretend that the shell itself is shalom. So I think it's the daring thing. I mean, one of my great mentors used to say, the cross comes when you try and change things. And I think there's a lot of profundity in that. And that for me is the case. A lot of Christians start with the cross. And I think the cross is at the heart of things, but the cross only comes when you commit yourself to the beatific vision, to shalom and what's name. And that's what you have to, grace and joy. And until we focus on those things, we're going to get lost, I think.
I wonder, are there specific things that you, thinking about the theological community in Australia, or the church community or other faith communities, specific actions that you think accomplices need to be engaged in right now, beyond the kind of, armchair ally?
Yes,
well, yeah.
I am quite, and I'm not distressed. I want to put this. My patience is wearing quite thin with some quarters of the church that say they are not hostile to LGBT people, but continually resist putting anything in that will build us up. So, and I don't mean, like in my own church, we're stuck over marriage liturgy. That won't change in any time soon. But there's other things you can do to do with just basically of things like if a transgender person wants to come out, I had to work that out for myself. And it was really painful. And a lot of people just give up and say, no, I'm going to go and find another job or something. And you don't know how it's going to pan out. And if someone comes out now as transgender in almost every diocese, including my own, they're still not guaranteed of how they're going to come out and how the support's going to be worked through. So there's no procedures in that. And that's absolute madness. That's just sort of basic HR. Do you know what I mean? This is not an issue of theology. So that's one thing. There are theological shifts, I think, have to be made. I mean, I think one of them is, and I was getting there, I think before, is I think the whole concept of the Imago Dei is quite difficult. I mean, I read a thing last year from my own church on marriage, which they deliberately excluded transgender people. And I thought, hello, I've been married to my wife for 35 years and I haven't got a say in this. But what they were saying, that they started off by saying that everyone, including reactionaries, agree that we're made in the image of God. But of course, immediately the fall is then brought in and that you are no longer really in the image of God. And I think the concept of the Imago Dei is very problematic, because as soon as you bring it in, you then start to populate that idea with your own idea of human perfection or whatever, instead of starting with the Imago Dei is not back there, it's ahead of us. That's what I'm saying, the transing. So the Imago Dei is what we emerge into. So there'll be signs of that. So I am now more in the Imago Dei of me than I was a few years ago, if you see what I mean. And so it's that shift towards, instead of that constant past stuff, looking at engaging with what's actually happening on the ground and in people's lives, rather than say imposing something that comes from outside. But it requires, that shakes things up, because you have to change things again, and that's going to cause conflict. But then you don't have life, you're never going to have any sort of life without some conflict in yourself. You know, we don't grow as an individual, do we? You know, whatever we do, even if it's a pleasant thing like getting married to somebody you deeply love, that's going to change you. And it's going, so, you know, there's going to be conflicts in it. Does that make, is that helpful at all? I don't know.
Just, yeah, blows up so many more interesting concepts. But I'm going to pass to Michelle now, and then back again. Janice, if you need to follow through, let's keep the questions happening.
Thanks, Jo. It may take me a little moment to get my question out, so that's okay. And I'm going to use the grammar of the personal, rather than try and kind of get it into the conceptual, because I guess I'm interested in the intricacies of the trans experience, of different types of trans experience. I love the idea of the transing, and feel in my own body the sense of that's a universal human vocation of the transformation, and I love that. But I know for my body, in my transing, I have some cultural safety around that because of what I'm transiting through. And for me, I've been so grateful for people who are transing through gender, because they can be my teachers, because they're forced into this embodiment of stuff which is beyond words. And you know, you're kind of ahead of me because of the nature of your particular experience, but then I'm the one who has the greater safety in being able to hide what I am transiting. And it's reminding me of, I heard an Aboriginal man recently say he was a man in transition. And it's, you know, so it's not just about gender, but for him, you know, his identity is seen every time he goes outside, and his transiting experience is very public, whereas I have the luxury of keeping mine private. So I'm kind of wrestling with this allies, you know, I don't like that dichotomy because we're all in it together, but how do I acknowledge that some people have less safety, even though for me they are my teachers?
Yes. Well, that's true, isn't it? I mean, I think sometimes the word, it's like privilege is thrown around. I mean, no doubt I always have a little bit of a chuckle when people say, oh, you benefited from male privilege. Well, I have, but in some ways, but I have benefited from male privilege because I was a woman, so I was trapped in the men's world. So that's not a lot of help. I think what you've said is really helpful. I mean, at this time I was supposed to be, if we hadn't had COVID-19, I'd been away for a few months on long leave. And I would have been possibly on the island of Lesbos. And at the moment, because we're going there at some point this month, and where, the refugee camp has, been set light to, and people have been sleeping on and all that, which brings it to the heart is that some of us, even, all of us who are in Australia in a way, are quite privileged because we don't have to have that extreme things, but because where we've got our own, we can identify in some way, I think, with that we don't shut ourselves away from it. And that's part of the paradox, isn't it, at the moment, that we've got closed state borders that people are railing about, the same people who wanted to keep strong borders around Australia to keep out the people who are camped in Lesbos and everything else. So I think we all have to deal with our own journeys, and some of us are fortunate, like me, to live in a country where being trans doesn't mean to say that I will die, as I might do if I lived in parts of Brazil or something, or America or other parts of the world, and that I have some access to medical care, not very much compared to some other places, but I have got some of those things. So I think all of us, the privilege thing is, I think it's a bit of it doesn't take us very well. I think I'd like to look for, well, what is it that we've got in common? So what you've actually identified there is, you've said, well, you can see yourself as transing and other people. And if we build on those, that's what will take us forward. And then we name what is truly privileged. And that's, to me, it's been part of the problem is that, you get lots of lateral violence if you're a trans person from people, alleging, various, and I just don't think it takes you very far. And we need to sort of be able to identify what are our real enemies. And some of them are our own thought patterns. That's back to the contemplative, thoughtful, attentive theology we need to do, examine our own preconceptions, because we, some of us, talking personally, have built the cells of our own captivity as well. But we also need to, more importantly, to really name what it is that's against us. And one of the big things, I know I'm jumping again, but I'm talking about how we do this transing together. I mean, we live in a culture that deliberately sets up to make us compete against one another, doesn't it? And to buy into a whole lot of things. And so to create something different, that's why we need community, I think, and the sort of collaboration that we are part of today.
So just in response to a couple of comments from Rebecca and Danielle, who mentioned the work of Alphys Reed and Keller,
yes,
the idea of God becoming as we become, and
yes,
the liberating and wonderful theology of Alphys Reed, the thought that we have to go through the process of gender effing God to break down
yes,
the patriarchal constructs. And she writes about, peeking under the skirts of God, this kind of kinky understanding that theology can be subversive and wild, which leads me to the question about the queering and the transing of God.
yes, that's it. Well, that's what to think. I mean, I woke up some so I'm going to say, and Penny said, oh, you can't say that. God is obviously transgender. Well, obviously God is transgender, but God actually isn't really. We need to move beyond that. God is male, female, and everything else. That's why I'm saying God is transing for all of us. And I know there's this whole thing, the Augustine thing. We will only find our rest in God, and God never changes, all those sorts of things. And maybe this is where I think the Orthodox at their best, the greatest Orthodox, are right. That we talk about, that's the difference about God in essence, isn't it? We don't know, and we can't possibly speak about God in essence, but we can have that as a sort of a limit statement, if you like, to make us not realize that any of our definitions are incomplete. But actually, everything we say about God, from the moment we open our mouth or start reading the Bible, is of us, and we need to own it, I think. And so I say this to people, and they say, oh, when you take a passage like Ruth and Naomi, I mean, for God's sake, if you've ever read that promise by Ruth, and I know there's another story with a Oprah and so on, but she, you know, where she makes that promise, I mean, if that isn't a covenantal marriage statement, you know, one of the most profound in the Bible, I don't know what is. I mean, what's going on? Or if you take the centurion's servant or the Ethiopian eunuch, I mean, they're all basically queer figures, and there are a whole lot of others that we've missed out, that we've only just sort of started. And people say, oh, but such and such, and I say, but I am not wanting. I think this is what I feel with theology. It's not trying to create a new dominant hegemony of way of doing things, is trying to break things open so it's possible for all the shells to be seen, rather than to say, well, I'm a big shiny shell that no one's noticed and everyone needs to sort of orientate themselves around me. That's a sort of identity politics sort of nonsense, isn't it? That people's accuse queer people of creating, but it isn't. We're just trying to say, this is the truth, the meaning we found in the Bible, because God is in this, and God is in our lives and in our bodies and everything else. And
that leads us round to a theology of discovery. If we go back to the beachcombing metaphor,
yes,
it's not so much about locating yourself as a shiny shell on the top, go and look at me. It's about being part of the entire presence on the beach. And the ascent, or the expectation, is that there is more to be discovered, which is the processing that Keller talks about.
Yes, and that's a humility. I suppose that is back to the point about the grammar of ascent things. I think humility has to be in it. But the thing is that the humility, and it's been particular, hasn't it, with women, 19th century, that Christian feminists are quite strong on this, that of the self-sacrifice of women and the humility that's expected of certain groups of people.
Oh, I want to leap in here and say, I think I would call bull on that. Humility is a little bit overrated sometimes. What about being able to be free enough to say, I'm going to make this statement about myself in celebration of
yes. Well, what I was going to say is that there's a lot of nonsense about humility, but I think there's a little bit sort of that. This is the becoming thing, the transing thing. You see, if you think you've arrived, I mean, you know, there is a little bit of a discourse sometimes for some trans people that, well, if only you do X, Y, Z. This is an old narrative. I think we're changing it now. But, you know, if only you get certain things sorted, and that, you know, you go, and then the final hurdle sometimes people say is, well, if you have your genital surgery, then after it, you've passed the finish line. But it's rubbish, because you haven't, because there's more to do. So what I'm saying is there's that humility of understanding, not humility over against other people. That humility is also partly about it's an offering, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? Your life as an offering. That I think that's where I feel what you're saying there, Kat. Yes, it is about celebration.
Yep.
And that, I suppose that's where I've moved into from ministry, and I'm finding it quite hard in church, as a lot of us are, to stay in churches and in the space I'm in, because I think we're still, if we're not stuck in, for queer people at least, and for women actually in general, in a basis of tolerating, or that lukewarm welcoming, we're included. Well, I don't just want to be included, because seriously, we're included in what? Something that's pretty awful and needs changing. And even affirming is a bit of a patronizing thing. It's got to be celebrating, hasn't it? It's got to be, you know, we've got to be able to give life to ourselves. That's part of our purpose. You know that wonderful story? I mean, you know that, you know, Adam and Eve and everything. I love the bits, because I'm not a biblical scholar as such, but as I understand it, they go on and on about Adam and Eve, don't they? Some people, about the fall and things. And then in the next chapter, Eve gives birth. And the thing it says is that Eve gives life, not God. It says Eve. And I sort of think, why have we passed that over? Do you know what I mean? It's like that human beings have that. I think that's what I'm trying to say yes to you, Cathy. That have the capacity that, you know, we are God bearers and we're God givers. That's part of the transing, isn't it? Because how can God trans unless we enable God to trans? Because we're the ones who have the God language, if you see what I mean.
Well, it's interesting that I reacted so strongly against the idea that you as a trans woman were entertaining the notion of humility. Because there's something about boldness, but I'm examining my own stuff in here, because I think the patriarchal landscape permits so many of us to take on the humble stance, rather than say, let us celebrate. What is there about you that can be celebrated? Find those words and make some new ways of talking about ourselves. I'm the first to say, I'm the first to adopt the humble posture And I think it's a resistance.
Yes.
In my 50s, I'm trying to think
Yes.
about that. And so I'm just owning my own space in that, but also wanting to be able to maybe ask you more about what it means to adopt a posture which reflects the theology of assent, of celebration,
Yes.
in resistance to everything that encourages just to shut up.
Yes. Well, I think.
Question.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, question,
I
yes?
guess a question. Actually, it's a bit of a statement because I'm listening to this without seeing you and on the phone, which is an interesting experience. It's an incredible experience. And the first thing I will say, Josephine will laugh at this, I'm sure. She knows me enough. As a Californian Episcopalian, as I use the last term there, the poem, what everybody's statements and questions, the poem that was read, the essence through the discussions and questions, and being from California, the faults bring violent earthquakes, and they come out of nowhere. But one thing that happens, it always renews and rise. It always rises. And on the shells, I remember walking along the beaches, and they're always, because the beach is a little steeper there, the shells moving along would just make this magical music. And the midden that was brought up, which brought back my childhood memories, our local cliff or bluff had the indigenous people's midden there. And the midden left behind was actually, it was broken. And what it was where they left their shells where they had eaten. In other words, they had broke bread together, and they had, and life was sustained. So I just wanted to get that the poem and your discussions. I just wanted to share that from thinking out of just from a Californian experience here in Australia and listening to that poem and your discussions.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think that's part of it. And of course, for First Nations people, that's all bound up, isn't it? I mean, I think what Michelle says in the feed there links this about the place of ritual, because we've sometimes separated this into special places, but it's actually part of life, that sort of, so if you're around a campfire, you're eating, or down by the creek or whatever, it's all part of one thing. I think that challenge, thank you for that, John. I think that's about, that deep connection and the connection with the whole of life. I think it's trying to get to that holistic, and maybe what Rebecca's saying here about relationship again, and
yes,
and the fault lines, we run up against, we usually grow, don't we, when we run up against problem of expression or difficulties of relationship. But then how do we negotiate that? I think ritual, and to come back to Michelle, because I think that was a little bit behind early, is I do think that's a very important thing. And Kath and I were talking yesterday. I know Kath's got a vision for having a festival in Dalesford, which I really love, the idea of a ritual under the skies in Dalesford and so on. And I think what I feel, where I'm heading at the moment, is that I feel that the churches in general, I can't speak for them, but their language and their lines confine us so much that we need to find new spaces. And I think part of the ritual is about connection, isn't it, ultimately? That deepening connection to the mystery of all being, but also to new things and breaking open new things. So it's a dangerous activity, but I think a lot of the time ritual is used as a control. So it provides us, in that sense, a shell that's important to hold our vulnerabilities, our pain and everything. But it also has to be a place which is also of breaking open the shell as well, and holding that tenderly.
How can ritual relate to that lovely phrase that was brought in from John, the magical music of shells?
Yes. Well, that's poetry, isn't it? You see, I mean, as an English person, I mean, the Church of England's liturgy isn't, my absolute thing, but it has more poetic images in, like the silent music of the spheres and everything like that, and drawing on that thing, and the Episcopal Church, for instance, has what the English call the spaceship thing, which talks about the planets and other, and in a beautiful poetic way. But when you come to the I don't know about the Uniting Church, but in the Anglican Church of Australia, it's written by, as I say, by constitutional type minded people, and people who are careful to find things that don't offend anyone. So it becomes leaden prose, really, to some degree. And so we're stuck with liturgy that, the prayer book's back in the mid-1990s, so it hasn't even caught up with ecological thinking. And so it needs to be, I mean, poets do need to talk to other people as well, but it is like, we need to cherish, in that sense, our artists, because they're the ones who are on the lines, aren't they, on the edge of the sea. I mean, it's significant, isn't it, in the poem, that Mary Oliver talks about going back to the edge of the sea. She's also talking about the morning light. So we're on these liminal spaces. And for me, the people who've always fed the spirit have been people who've been, often to their own great cost, on the margins, on the limits, and crossing over. And crossing over is quite can be quite painful. But
your use of liminality draws me back to Michelle. Did you have a question, Michelle?
Kind of a sad point, I guess, that for ritual to be effective, it needs, as a transformative capacity, it needs to be safe. And
yes.
It's those questions of what do we do about being in the church, because I'm not going to put myself back in a church ritual that is not, there is absolutely no point doing a ritual when it is not safe. So
yes,
you
have to be absolutely clear, don't you? I mean, I think that the thing, I mean, the MCC pastor up here talks about, of sexually and gender diverse people. We're playing Russian roulette if we go to a new church, usually, unless it's made absolutely clear these days that, up front, and like the cathedral we have here in Brisbane, has its, not just a rainbow flag outside, but other, flags of other diverse people and things. And there's a genuine commitment, although it's not, it's got limits, but it is a safe, but you have to have that. People have to be deliberate about it. And that's my frustration with institutions and groups that won't make that commitment. Then really, can we stay? Because like you say, you can't thrive if you're constantly worried that something will go wrong. I mean, I when I was up in Toowoomba, we had some lovely people in my church, in the central church there, and absolutely gorgeous. And we were positive, and we had some people come to us, from who had lost off the sort of somewhat conservative Christianity in Toowoomba. But I remember somebody saying to me, "So will it be safe if I come?" And I said, "Well, you'd be safe with a lot of the leaders and with me, but I cannot guarantee that there aren't people in my congregation that won't act and say things that might be hurtful." And so, and that can't really be, whilst the leadership of certain groups, not just churches, isn't clear. Like Prime Minister, for instance, well, that certain types of behaviour won't be just to be stopped. I mean, that's the first hand of non-violence. It's like, stop, no, there's going to be no more nonsense about trans people, no more religious discrimination things, and then we'll work out how we live together. But the first thing is to say, you are safe, and then you can be in the dialogue. And it's astonishing to me that they expect. I mean, it's frustrating to me. I mean, a little bit better, isn't it, in the Uniting Church? But in the Anglican Church, it's very hard to get gay people, gay clergy to speak, because they're going to, once they put their heads up above the parapet, then they're targets. So you can't have a proper debate when you haven't guaranteed people's safety. So that's why we have to have spaces like this one, and why, as I said at the beginning, it was really important to me to know not only would a trans person be safe here, but that will be able to speak. But that doesn't just go for me, does it? It's to do with other people. We have to constantly look at ourselves and say, well, who are the voices that we hear? Who is actually pictured? And because otherwise we just fall back into default mode.
So drawing you back to your original metaphor, the shoreline needs to be protected as a sacred space so that the shells can be discovered. I mean,
yes.
And
yeah.
how do we do this? So I'm mindful that there are many people in the room. Is there anyone that has a question or a comment that hasn't actually managed to maneuver their way in yet? If we can just pause for a moment, you might like to write it or raise your hands. Emma.
I was interested in your talking about being overt in making spaces safe for people. I was wondering if there's other things apart from, you know, flag and language and things like that, other visual things, other ways of being that can be done to send the signals without, you know, being overt and clumsy of going, you know, hi, you know, you are safe here. But, you know, are there other signals that we can do that they send that message?
Well, I think it's about, isn't it, comes back to, I always come back to the Jesus thing about, you know, where he says, he takes when they're arguing about power and inclusion, really, to some degree, who's going to be inclusion, and he takes a child and puts it in the center of them. Now, the child, it's not just because it's a child, because it's the really super vulnerable person. And I sometimes think, you know, and I don't want to become, you know, super, put all the what's names, but if it was a disabled Aboriginal person from a remote community who was gender diverse and what's name, I mean, you could, you know, those would be, who is represented and how are we doing it? You know, how is our space constructed, you know, for people? I mean, we have a marvelous woman who's a little bit of a disability advocate, but she'd never been asked to read in church. And then we asked her, so, oh, do you want to read? And she said, oh no, I can't, because I can't get behind the lectern. And I can't get up onto the step. And so I said, well, that doesn't matter. And actually, because she just rolled her thing forward and was in the middle of the church. That's the point. So this is back to the real image of God, isn't it? That we become, now we start to see the image of God present amongst us. But I mean, she has a great trouble getting into our cathedral, bless them. They're very wonderfully affirming and lots of things. But you can't get in there very easily. You have to go right round the side to get in, you know, to get your wheelchair. And then if you go into meetings, top meetings, you can't get through doors because they're not wide enough. So there's all of those practical things. But I think it is representation, isn't it? Representation. I mean, that's what people used to say to me. You know, that it's about young people, isn't it, as well? And sometimes, but you know, people say, well, why aren't there more Aboriginal people in our church? Well, if you walked into a church, I mean, you walk into a church, where are Aboriginal people represented? Look up the pictures, they're white pictures, and there's nothing of us. But what makes a big difference is if you have an Aboriginal minister, you get a little bit of traction then, unless they're trapped in the system. But I mean, people come to, I've had more people, I mean, quite a few people have come to odd bits and pieces we've done here. They haven't joined the church in the way that the bishops would like it to do. But I mean, they've been in our chapel and things, and they say, this is the first time I've been in a church for 30 years, and all that, and all the old joke about the roof not falling down. And it's about, if you're serious about these things, it's no good just, you know, having, like on Aboriginality thing, it's no good having, you know, reading out an Aboriginal statement or something. That's very lovely, but you've actually got to get out of the way and let those people be there. Then people can see you. Then we see the church's different shape. And if it means they won't come in the building, which a lot of people won't, they're scared to, and I don't blame gay people not going anywhere near a church ever. And I really don't, you know, I sometimes say to people, the best thing you can do is stay away spiritually, you know, for the rest of your life, probably. But go to be with them, you know, and, you know, that's the problem, isn't it, with mission, is that we think it belongs to us rather than, you know, it's already happening in the world. Well, let's catch up. Let's go and join things, you know. And it's not just, you know, having a, what do you call it, float on the Mardi Gras or something. It's got to go a bit deeper than that, I think.
Just drawing us to a question that, or a statement that Michelle's made about communicating safety as a felt sensing. I recently read a book by it doesn't really matter who, a woman who had written about leadership, and she actually said, if something doesn't feel right, that's enough. We're trained to look for something else, look for other evidence, but actually to really trust what we're feeling as being a resource that tells us whether something is safe or appropriate or engaging.
Yes.
Moving into feeling and felt sensing as an honorable place to work from. Maybe Michelle or Joe would like to comment on that.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. However, I was thinking about, conspiracy theorists and anti-vaxxers, extreme anti-vaxxers and things. That feeling is not necessarily, that's where I think discernment, you see, that's why I think we do need soul friends with us, because sometimes our feelings may be misplaced, but the deep down feelings are the thing. And that's it, at the end of the day. I know, I couldn't possibly, I'm not a man. And that's the deep down thing. And ultimately you have to face that. And so that space is vital. And one of the key problems we have in this whole area, isn't it? There was that, I think there was something earlier there about, and it is to do with safety thing, is it Carol Labash or someone like that, who wrote about in trying to develop a new sexual ethic, and churches are completely shot with them, we've got nothing really much to offer most of the time, and about appropriate vulnerability. And that's the tension, isn't it? With I'm not against borders, and although I'm desperate to see my grandchildren in New South Wales and ACT, I think generally we've been right in Queensland to keep our borders, but they've been appropriate for the time. But if it's about protection, the old, Queensland First type thing, which I think Labour are playing on a little bit, then I think that's wrong. So it's about working out what is actually, an appropriate sort of shell protection, and what is actually, in fact, exclusionary. I think that's the thing. I've read a little bit, J.K. Rowling's attack on things, and she obviously had a lot of pain as she grew up, as a girl and as a young woman, which you can quite understand. But her target's wrong, and so the borders she's putting in actually hurt other people, and it's not actually addressing those questions that are genuinely for a lot of cisgender women, which do need to be addressed. But you're causing violence to other people by coming up with inappropriate means. So I suppose it's a combination with a feeling. You've got a feeling, can sieve it out, but what is the appropriate response to make? And that probably needs, let's say, discernment together, rather than saying, trans people have got this solution. Well, we might need to talk about other people as well. There's a little bit of conversation there. Does that make sense? I don't know.
Question.
Yes, speak up.
Yes. Joe hit me with like a kind of a punch in the head. I don't mean that violently. As an Episcopalian, and as we know, they've been reprimanded by the Anglican Communion for being very, as Joe called it, the spaceship, are taking off, and because of so many schisms and things. The one thing, going back to the metaphor of the poem, there's so many shells on the beach, different types. Some are broken, some are whole. And there was a question about not going into church because I don't want to be more harmed or damaged. Now, as an Episcopalian, I'm scared. I used to live in Newcastle, and the church was Anglican church was quite wonderful there. But I live down in Torquay. I'm scared to go into the Anglican church here by myself. By myself as one shell, and I've often said that we need to get the word from the church out onto the streets. But I think it was Michelle saying going in, and I immediately thought, maybe I should be going into the Anglican church. And I can be brave by myself, but perhaps those that need the comfort of other shells around them go in with one or two together quietly amongst and go in. And as Joe mentioned about the disabled person, you know, finally kind of being on stage, that perhaps that's how we transform, create a positive schism, an earthquake into our religious institutions. So in other words, we need I was looking at it as going from the church going out onto the streets into the community, but actually, I can also see the value of going into the church and kind of to get in with those shells and let them see my gloss. I'll be a glossy shell.
Version of ministry practice, really, aren't you? It's not the church going out; it's the community going in. There's something subversive about that.
Well, that's the tide, isn't it?
Mm.
Yes. And we might just also want, where I think I'm at is, well, maybe we should be sort of seeing where the word and the spirit is out in the streets or wherever else in the fields or down by the stream and all the rest of it. And building that, because maybe places become too toxic. I remember the first time we did a transgender remembrance service in a church in in Brisbane, and we had some. It was wonderful. We got all sorts of people come. I say people who'd never come to a church before, and we were very nervous about doing it. And we ended up doing it in the church hall. And the reason was the church building itself had got some pests in it, you know, and so they had to spray it. And I thought it was a brilliant symbol, really, that the church needed detoxifying before anybody could use it. But what we did was to find another place. So, I mean, that's my view, is that I think that's what's feel, John. I mean, I admire, you know, for doing that, for some people to go. And I think some of us, sadly, I mean, someone asked me recently, why'd you stay? And you do wonder. I said, well, that's a daily question. but we have to listen to ourselves, that deep thing. Well, where can we best put our attentions, and then support people across those different places. But if we don't nurture, I think, is new spaces, you know, that, so use institutional things where you can, because I mean, for God's sake, we won't ever have any money or resources if we never get hold of them some way. But create, you know, nurture gardens and beautiful things. That's what we have to do, I think. Otherwise, we find ourselves ultimately confined and just locked into a protest and frustration. And
Joe,
yeah.
this feels like the beginning of something new, and I think I'm going to draw us to a conclusion now. There's been so much talked about, so many beautiful images, and also painful and stressful topics. I'd like to draw people to the attention in the chat for your website, and also let everyone know that Jo's work and some of her thinking, a small section of her thinking, is represented in a collection that we are publishing, well, Routledge is publishing, but the Australian Collaborators in Feminist Theology has put together about power, authority, and love. A few of us are in there, but this is about Jo today. And she's written beautifully about the metaphor of thought and intersecting with some of her ideas. Can I suggest, Jo, that you read the poem again?
Yes, that's a great idea.
We end with a little moment of silence in gratitude of the many different thoughts that you have blessed us with today, knowing that this is just a conversation that keeps going. And if anyone does finish this session and feel like that the conversation has been disruptive in a way that is difficult to manage, can I just check in that everyone has someone to call or ring, somewhere to go? And I include myself with this. You know, some of these conversations they are disruptive and distressing sometimes. So just a little check-in. If you do not have someone to ring, send a private message and we'll make sure that you do. If you feel like you need to follow up just with a conversation, especially given this time when we can't all leap to the cafe and have a margarita together. If we just together, so thankful, Jo, for your work and your presence, your tenacity, the transing that you are engaging with, and the gifts that you continue to give us, and the gift that you are to our community.
Thank you. And I do it really, I mean, it sounds a bit, my hope is that, I mean, there's lots of gender diversity, and increasing, that's why I mentioned Sorrel earlier, in Adelaide, that increasingly there are wonderful gender diverse people out there. And so I'm sort of pushing my head up because I've got my own perspective, but there's lots of other people that we need to engage because they can enrich us. So I'll read the poem.
Oh, 1 minute, sorry, just Sarah's just asked whether or not we can receive a copy of the chat. What we're doing is that we are roughly editing, when we say roughly, keeping the body of the text together, our conversations. Previous month we had Sharon Hollis. We're putting them on our website, the Australian Collaborators in Feminist Theologies. If you have any trouble finding it, you can contact us. But it means that this conversation now is out there. So you can feel free to pass on the dialogue as it continues to, well, it's a kind of transing dialogue. It will continue to be present there. And even more thankful that it's not just a one-off, it's kind of going to be out there now. So we'll pass over to Jo. If you'd like to read the poem, and then the people that have, myself, Rebecca, Jo, Janice, Talitha, we will stay present until people leave, just so there's a sense of hospitality as we accompany one another at the end of this dialogue. Thank you, Jo.
Okay. Poem's called Breakage by Mary Oliver. I go down to the edge of the sea. How everything shines in the morning light. The cusp of the whelk, the broken cupboard of the clam, the opened blue mussels, moon snails, pale pink and barnacles scarred, and nothing at all whole or shut, but tattered, split, dropped by the gulls onto the grey rocks, and all the moisture gone. It's like a schoolhouse of little words, thousands of words. First you figure out what each one means by itself. The jingle, the periwinkle, the scallop, full of moonlight. Then you begin slowly to read the whole story.
Thank you. My heart is full. In gratitude for Jo. We will see you all next month.